Criminalization of curiosity. How answers from uncanny questions became prosecutable war crimes. By Pirate First.
Curiosity Part 4. The Criminalization of Curiosity. July 4, 2026. Unauthorized Questions. Part 1 introduced, in outline, the mechanism this book has spent 2 parts developing at the depth outline could only gesture toward: access gating, context justification, and retroactive reclassification, the 3 instruments Chapter 1 identified as relocating the checkpoint from the answer a forensic model produces to the standing of the person requesting it. Part 3 supplied what Part 1 could not yet offer: the reason those instruments assembled themselves with the speed and coordination they did, once the glass and smoke arrangement traced across 6 chapters encountered, for the first time, a population capable of directing an equivalent instrument back. This chapter begins Part 4 by returning to the specific legal category those instruments actually produced, and asking what unauthorized has come to mean in statutory practice, now that the full architecture is in view. The category that had no precedent to borrow from. Every legal category has to borrow its structure from somewhere, and it is worth tracing what the unauthorized question category borrowed from, because the borrowing reveals more than any legislative history document states directly. It could not borrow cleanly from defamation law, which requires a false statement and does not apply to an accurate reconstruction, however unwelcome. It could not borrow cleanly from trade secret law, which Chapter 14 of this book identified as protecting an institution's own proprietary methods, not the population's ability to ask about outcomes those methods produced using records the institution was independently required to generate. It could not borrow cleanly from harassment or stalking statutes, which require a targeted individual and a pattern of unwanted contact, neither of which describes a citizen querying a forensic model about aggregate institutional conduct. What the category actually borrowed from, once the specific statutory language is traced across the jurisdictions this book has been drawing on, is export control law, the body of statute originally built to restrict the transfer of militarily sensitive technology across national borders, repurposed with only modest adaptation, to restrict the transfer of forensic analytical capacity across the boundary between institution and citizen. This borrowing was not disclosed as borrowing in any legislative debate this book's research has located. It did not need to be disclosed because export control law offered something no other available body of statute could: a pre-existing legal architecture in which the default runs toward restriction rather than permission, in which the burden of establishing legitimate purpose sits with the party requesting access rather than the party controlling it, and in which dual use, a technology or capability with both legitimate and dangerous applications, already supplied a ready-made vocabulary for treating a forensic query's potential misuse as sufficient grounds for restricting its ordinary use. This is the precise mechanism by which access gating, named in Chapter 1 without its legal genealogy, became statutorily coherent rather than merely rhetorically convenient. Forensic query capability was classified, functionally if not always explicitly, as a dual-use instrument in the export control sense, and the population requesting access to it was placed in the position export control law has always placed the party requesting a restricted transfer, required to establish legitimate end use before the transfer occurs, rather than permitted to receive it and be held accountable afterward for any illegitimate use actually made of it. What makes a question unauthorized? Trace the statutory language itself, examined across the jurisdictions with the most developed version of this apparatus, and the category resolves into 3 overlapping tests, none of which appears designed in isolation but all of which function in combination as the operational definition of unauthorized this part is examining. The first test is aggregation threshold, a query or pattern of queries that would allow the reconstruction of information about an entity's operations at a scope exceeding what any single disclosed record would individually reveal. This test is the direct statutory descendant of the scale problem Chapter 8 of this book described from the auditor's side. What makes a reconstruction valuable to a forensic auditor, the combination of individually disclosed fragments into an integrated picture no single fragment reveals, is the exact feature the aggregation threshold test criminalizes. The test does not require any single piece of information in the query to be improperly obtained. It requires only that the combination exceed a threshold no statute defines with operational precision, which places the actual boundary in the hands of whichever enforcement authority applies the test after the fact, precisely the retroactive reclassification mechanism Chapter 1 named without yet showing its statutory mechanics. The second test is purpose disclosure, the requirement, examined in its practical operation in Chapter 2 of this book, that a query's downstream use be stated in advance and found acceptable by whatever review process the jurisdiction has established. What Chapter 2 identified as a status conferred on the asker rather than a property of the question is, in the statutory text itself, formally described as a purpose test applied to the query. The gap between the statute's stated criteria and its actual operation, which Chapter 2 traced through the vocabulary of research versus reconnaissance, is not a failure of implementation. It is the test performing exactly the sorting function this book has argued was its purpose from the start, using purpose disclosure as the mechanism by which an asker's institutional reachability becomes legally determinative without ever being named as the actual criterion. The third test is capability match, the newest and, this chapter argues, the most consequential of the 3 because it does not evaluate the query at all. It evaluates the underlying forensic instrument's aggregate capability and restricts access to instruments above a defined capability threshold regardless of any individual query's content or stated purpose. This test converts the unauthorized question category from something applied to specific acts of asking into something applied to the instrument itself. A shift this chapter argues is the actual endpoint the first two tests were building toward, and Part 5 of this book will examine directly as the moment access restriction becomes indistinguishable from restricting the auditor's existence. Why the first two tests could never be enforced consistently. It is worth pausing on a specific operational problem the aggregation threshold and purpose disclosure tests both share, because the problem explains why enforcement has been, across every jurisdiction this book has examined, selective rather than comprehensive, and selective enforcement applied to a facially neutral statute is itself a pattern this book has treated as diagnostic since Chapter 3's account of the manufactured enemy. Neither test can be applied at the volume the underlying activity actually occurs at. Millions of queries, across every forensic system operating in any jurisdiction with this apparatus in place, exceed some plausible aggregation threshold or involve some undisclosed downstream purpose in the ordinary course of entirely unremarkable use. A small business owner researching a competitor's public regulatory history, a job applicant researching a prospective employer's disclosed labor practices, a tenant researching a landlord's public housing court record. Enforcing either test against this volume comprehensively would require a review apparatus larger than any jurisdiction has built or plausibly could build. What every jurisdiction has built instead is an apparatus adequate to enforcing the test selectively against whichever queries happen to draw institutional attention, which returns this chapter to the diagnostic Chapter 3 established. Enforcement concentrates not where the statutory criteria are most clearly met, but where the underlying reconstruction happens to threaten a specific, identifiable institutional interest closely enough that the institution has reason to invoke the apparatus at all. This is the precise mechanism by which a facially neutral, generally worded statute produces the outcome Chapter 2 of this book described without yet supplying its enforcement mechanics. A category that could, in principle, apply to almost anyone, applied in practice to almost no one except the specific unaffiliated askers, whose reconstructions happen to land somewhere an institution with the standing to trigger enforcement was watching. What this chapter leaves for Part 4. This chapter has traced the category's legal genealogy and its three operational tests. It has not yet examined the specific instrument through which the tests are actually applied to an ordinary person before they ever run a query. The credentialing and permission apparatus this book's remaining Part 4 chapters call, respectively, curiosity licenses and audit permits, and the specific professional populations, examined in the chapters after that, who have found themselves on the receiving end of an enforcement apparatus originally justified, in every legislative record this book has consulted, as protection against a much narrower and much more genuinely dangerous category of misuse than the one it has actually been used against. Chapter 19 turns to the first of those instruments directly, the curiosity license, and what it means for a jurisdiction to require, as a precondition for asking a forensic model a question about public institutional conduct, exactly the kind of prior authorization this book's opening chapter identified as having no precedent anywhere in the history of a citizen's relationship to a fact already sitting, however distributed, in the public record. Curiosity licenses. Chapter 18 closed on the specific instrument through which the three statutory tests it traced are applied to an ordinary person before they ever run a query. This chapter examines that instrument directly, the curiosity license, and the particular legal achievement it represents. The first credentialing regime in the history this book has traced that governs not what a person may do with an answer, but whether a person may ask a question at all. What a license ordinarily governs. It is worth stating the ordinary case before examining its inversion, because the inversion is easy to miss if the ordinary case is not held clearly in view first. Licensing regimes across every domain under duress traced and every domain this book has examined since have historically governed the exercise of a capability whose misuse carries a specific, demonstrable risk to third parties who did not consent to bear it, the practice of medicine, the operation of heavy machinery, the provision of legal representation. The license is not, in any of these cases, a barrier to knowledge. It is a barrier to action taken on the basis of knowledge, applied because the action itself, performed incompetently or in bad faith, produces harm independent of whether the actor understood what they were doing. A curiosity license, as the term has come to be used across the jurisdictions this part is examining, governs something categorically different, and the difference is the entire argument of this chapter. It does not license the use of a forensic reconstruction, publishing it, acting on it, presenting it as the basis for a legal claim, each of which remains in every jurisdiction this book has examined, governed by the ordinary bodies of law that have always applied to defamation, fraud, and professional misconduct. It licenses the reconstruction itself, the act of directing a forensic model at a question above the aggregation threshold Chapter 18 described, before any downstream use has occurred, before any harm independent of the asking has been produced, and in the overwhelming majority of documented cases before any harm ever will be. This is the specific inversion Chapter 1 of this book identified in the abstract, restated here with the statutory mechanics fully in view. Every previous licensing regime this book has traced regulates the bridge between knowledge and action. The curiosity license regulates the bridge between question and answer, a bridge no licensing regime in the history this book has examined had ever previously claimed jurisdiction over, because no previous era possessed an instrument capable of producing, from a single unaffiliated query, an answer substantial enough to seem worth licensing. The application itself. Examine the application process as it actually operates, across the jurisdictions with the most developed version of this regime, because the form the license takes reveals what it is actually screening for more precisely than any statutory preamble does. An applicant is required, in every documented version of this process, to state an intended research domain, not a specific question which the application form typically does not request, but a general territory. Financial services, employment practices, housing policy, platform governance. The applicant is required to state an institutional affiliation, where one exists and where none exists, to provide an alternative form of accountability the reviewing body finds acceptable, a named professional reference, a stated publication venue, in several documented cases a refundable bond intended, according to the enabling legislation's stated purpose, to offset the administrative cost of reviewing an unaffiliated applicant's request. The applicant is required to consent, as a condition of the license's issuance, to the disclosure of their query history to the reviewing authority upon request, a condition that converts the license, once granted, into a standing surveillance relationship of exactly the one-directional kind Part 3 of this book traced in detail, now formalized and applied specifically to the population attempting to direct the equivalent instrument back. None of these requirements, examined individually, screens for the harm the enabling legislation's stated purpose identifies, the misuse of forensic reconstruction to harass, defraud, or endanger a specific identifiable party. All of them, examined together, reproduce with precision the three markers Chapter 2 of this book identified as what the research/reconnaissance distinction actually sorts by: institutional letterhead, disclosed destination, and, in the query history disclosure requirement specifically, exactly the kind of ongoing institutional reachability Chapter 4 of this book identified as the property institutions actually require of an asker before they can treat that asker as safely contained. What the license actually prices. Chapter 18 noted that neither the aggregation threshold nor the purpose disclosure test could be enforced comprehensively at the volume ordinary use actually occurs at, and that selective enforcement was itself diagnostic of the apparatus's real function. The curiosity license solves this enforcement problem for its architects in a way neither prior test managed on its own, and the solution is worth stating plainly. The license does not need to be enforced against every unlicensed query to be effective. It needs only to exist at a cost, in application fee, in disclosure requirement, in processing delay, in the several documented jurisdictions requiring a bond, sufficient to make the ordinary, unremarkable exercise of forensic curiosity not worth the transaction cost for the overwhelming majority of people who might otherwise have exercised it. This is the mechanism Chapter 1 of this book named in its account of the day curiosity became suspicious, restated here as a fully developed statutory instrument rather than an anticipated tendency. A population does not need to be prosecuted into caution if the caution can be priced in advance, quietly enough that most of the population never tests the price directly and simply adjusts its behavior to the assumption that the price is not worth paying. The curiosity licenses enforcement statistics, in every jurisdiction this book has examined data from, show remarkably few actual denials. They do not need to show many. The application process itself, not its outcome, is the instrument doing the work. Precisely the access gating function Chapter 1 identified before this chapter supplied its full mechanism. The asymmetry the license makes permanent. Part 3 of this book traced, across 6 chapters, an architecture in which institutions achieved persistent, cross-domain, continuously updated observation of a governed population while that population possessed no equivalent instrument pointed back. An asymmetry Chapter 17 described as never balanced and never intended to be, sustained for decades by scale and distribution rather than by any single deliberate barrier. The curiosity license converts that historically contingent asymmetry into a formally licensed one. It does not merely fail to correct the imbalance Part 3 described. It requires the population on the disadvantaged end of that imbalance to seek and pay for, and disclose their ongoing activity in exchange for, permission to attempt the correction at all, while imposing no equivalent licensing requirement on the institutional side's own continued collection, which Chapter 14 of this book established had never required a comparable license to begin with, and does not require one now. This is the precise sense in which the curiosity license is not a new instrument of institutional advantage but the old asymmetry Part 3 traced, given, for the first time, explicit statutory form, no longer merely the product of scale and distribution outrunning any individual's capacity to reconstruct it, but a deliberate, defended, and now formally credentialed barrier, erected at exactly the moment scale and distribution stopped being sufficient on their own. Chapter 20 turns to what the license authorizes even when it is granted. The audit permit regime that governs not whether a citizen may ask but how far, into which domains, and under what continuing supervision, an already licensed curiosity is permitted to reach. The next layer of an apparatus this part is tracing from the outside in. The coming audit permits. Chapter 19 closed on the license that governs whether a citizen may ask. This chapter turns to the layer built on top of it, still emerging rather than fully settled in the jurisdictions this book has been tracing, and worth examining now precisely because it is not yet finished. The audit permit regime, which governs not the initial grant of standing but the specific scope, domain, and duration of what a licensed asker is subsequently permitted to reconstruct. Why a second layer became necessary. The curiosity license, as Chapter 19 described it, solved an access problem for its architects, pricing ordinary curiosity out of most people's willingness to pursue it, without requiring comprehensive enforcement against the volume of activity the aggregation and purpose tests could never practically cover. It did not solve a second problem this part has been building toward across 2 chapters, and the problem is one the license's own design inadvertently sharpened rather than resolved. A small number of applicants, precisely the population with the strongest motivation to pursue a forensic reconstruction and the least deterred by application cost or disclosure requirements, obtained licenses anyway, and having obtained them, faced no statutory limit on what domain, what institution, or what time span their licensed curiosity could subsequently be directed at. This is the specific gap the audit permit regime has emerged to close. Across the several jurisdictions this book has tracked developing some version of it over the period this part covers. Where the curiosity license asks whether a person may direct forensic capability at institutional conduct at all, the audit permit asks a narrower and, this chapter argues, considerably more consequential question. Having been granted general standing, may the specific license party direct that standing at the specific institution, the specific domain, the specific span of years, and if so, under what continuing terms? The permit's actual architecture. The regime, examined across its most developed instances, operates through three mechanisms that extend the license's logic from a one-time gate into a continuing supervisory relationship. The first is domain-specific renewal. A license granted for general research standing does not, under the emerging permit regime, authorize an open-ended reconstruction of any institution the license holder subsequently chooses to examine. Each specific institutional target or class of institutional target requires its own permit application, its own stated scope, and, in the jurisdictions with the most developed version of this requirement, its own renewal on a fixed schedule, typically far shorter than the underlying license's own term. This converts what Chapter 19 described as a one-time transaction cost into a recurring one, applied specifically at the moment a licensed asker's curiosity narrows onto a particular institution rather than remaining general, which is to say, applied specifically at the moment the reconstruction becomes capable of producing the kind of institution-specific finding this book has argued institutions actually fear. The second is scope notification, which requires the license holder to disclose, in advance of running a specific reconstruction, the general shape of the finding they expect to be examining for, not the conclusion, which the applicant by definition does not yet have, but the hypothesis. This requirement produces a document trail this book's research has found cited, in more than one enforcement proceeding, as evidence of the applicant's prior intent, in a manner that converts the ordinary, unremarkable practice of forming a working hypothesis before conducting research, standard practice in every legitimate research tradition this book has examined, into a piece of evidence usable against the applicant if the hypothesis, once tested, proves correct and the finding proves inconvenient to the institution examined. The third, and the mechanism this chapter treats as the permit regime's actual center of gravity, is retroactive scope review, the authority, reserved to the permitting body in every version of this regime this book has examined, to determine after a reconstruction is complete that its actual findings exceeded the scope the original permit authorized, regardless of whether the query that produced those findings was itself properly scoped at the time it was run. This is Chapter 1's retroactive reclassification mechanism, restated here in its most fully developed statutory form. A reconstruction can be lawful at every stage of its production and still be found, after the fact, to have exceeded its authorization, because the authorization was always defined by its anticipated scope rather than its actual result, and results, as every honest forensic reconstruction this book has described demonstrates, are not reliably anticipatable in advance by the party running the query. What the permit regime reveals about the license's original purpose. Chapter 19 argued that the curiosity license's enforcement statistics showed few actual denials, and that the application process itself, rather than its outcome, was the instrument doing the work of deterrence. The emergence of the audit permit regime supplies a piece of evidence this book did not have available when Chapter 19 was written. For the small population of applicants the license failed to deter, a second, more granular instrument was required, which means the license was never intended, by its own architect's revealed preference, to be a complete solution to the problem this part has been tracing. It was intended to filter volume, leaving a permit regime to handle the residual population whose motivation the license's transaction costs could not price out. This two-layer structure, a broad, low-friction filter followed by a narrow, high-friction supervisory regime applied only to whoever the first filter fails to deter, is not a novel institutional design. It is the same structure under duress traced across several of the credentialing architectures examined in that book's earlier parts, adapted here to a new domain. A general barrier calibrated to discourage the population whose exit cost from simply not bothering is low, paired with a more intensive, individually tailored barrier reserved for the population whose motivation survives the general barrier and who therefore, by the same logic Chapter 3 of this book applied to the manufactured enemy, are treated as requiring more direct and more continuous management precisely because they have demonstrated they cannot be deterred by cost alone. What is still unsettled? This chapter has described the permit regime as still emerging rather than fully settled, and that qualification matters for what this book can honestly claim. The domain-specific renewal and scope notification mechanisms are, at the time of this writing, established practice in the jurisdictions with the most developed version of this apparatus. The retroactive scope review authority remains contested, challenged, in at least the cases this book's research has been able to track, on grounds that a standard defined only after the fact cannot function as a standard at all, and that a permit regime reserving the authority to redefine its own scope retroactively has abandoned the basic due process requirement that a person be able to know, in advance, what conduct is and is not permitted before they are held accountable for it. Whether that challenge succeeds is not a question this book can answer with confidence, because it has not yet been resolved in the jurisdictions where it has been raised. What this chapter can state with more confidence is the trajectory the challenge is responding to. A regime that began in Chapter 18's account as 3 statutory tests applied to a query has become, across 2 further chapters, a licensing gate applied to the asker and a permitting structure applied to the specific reconstruction, each layer justified in its own legislative history as a narrower and more carefully calibrated response to a genuine risk, and each layer examined together rather than separately, reproducing with increasing precision the exact asymmetry Part 3 of this book traced as the thing this entire apparatus exists to protect. Chapter 21 turns from the general architecture of licensing and permitting to the specific professional populations who have found themselves, in practice, on the receiving end of this apparatus most directly, the programmers, data scientists, and forensic analysts whose ordinary professional conduct now falls, more often than any of the enabling legislation stated purpose anticipated, on the wrong side of a line this part has shown was never drawn where its architects claimed it was. Polygraphs for programmers. Chapter 20 closed by promising an examination of the specific professional populations the licensing and permitting architecture has landed on most directly. This chapter takes up the first and, in the enforcement data this book has been able to assemble, the most heavily affected of those populations, the programmers, engineers, and infrastructure specialists whose ordinary professional conduct, building, maintaining, and querying the forensic systems this book has examined throughout, now generates a specific and increasingly formalized form of scrutiny this chapter's title names directly, because the mechanism examined closely is functionally a polygraph in every respect except the machine. Why programmers became the first target. It is worth asking why this specific population, rather than the researchers, journalists, or private citizens Part IV's opening chapters have focused on, became the apparatus's most intensively monitored group, because the answer clarifies something about the entire regime that the earlier chapters could only imply. A licensed researcher submits a scoped query and receives a bounded answer. A programmer with the access required to build, maintain, or modify the forensic system itself is positioned, structurally, at a point in the architecture no scoping requirement, however granular, can fully contain, because the programmer's access is not to a single answer but to the system's capacity to produce answers generally, which places them, in the logic Chapter 18 identified as the third and most consequential of the statutory tests, permanently on the wrong side of the capability match threshold regardless of what any specific query they run actually contains. This is the structural reason the audit permit regime's domain-specific query-level architecture, examined in Chapter 20, proves inadequate to this population, and why a different instrument emerged specifically to address it. A permit scoped to a specific reconstruction cannot meaningfully bound a person whose ordinary job requires touching the system's full capability as a matter of routine maintenance. The apparatus, confronted with a population it could not scope at the query level, moved instead to scoping the person, screening not what they ask but what they intend on an ongoing and periodically renewed basis. To do with access the nature of their work requires them to hold continuously rather than request transactionally. The mechanism itself. The instrument that resulted, formally titled in most of the jurisdictions this book, has examined some variant of a continuing trust assessment or access integrity review, operates through a combination of methods that earns the polygraph comparison on its merits rather than as rhetorical exaggeration. The assessment includes, in every documented version this book's research has located, a structured interview conducted at intervals, typically annual, in several jurisdictions semi-annual for personnel with the highest tier of system access, covering the subject's professional associations, their personal use of the systems they maintain professional access to, and, in the specific provision this chapter treats as the assessment's actual center of gravity, their stated views on the legitimacy of the institutions their systems are capable of examining. This last category deserves to be stated plainly rather than summarized, because summary understates how directly it departs from every prior professional screening tradition this book has examined. Engineers are asked, as a documented condition of continued access, whether they believe the institutions their forensic systems could be directed at are operating legitimately, a question with no equivalent in any licensing regime under duress traced for any other profession, because no prior professional credential has ever required an assessment of the credential holder's political or institutional opinions as a condition of continued practice. The assessment is supplemented, in the jurisdictions with the most developed version of this regime, by behavioral monitoring of the subject's own query activity conducted through the same systems they maintain. A specific and, this chapter argues, structurally revealing choice, because it means the population most capable of directing forensic reconstruction at institutional conduct is also the population most continuously and comprehensively reconstructed by the same instrument, in exactly the one-directional relationship Part 3 of this book traced as the architecture's oldest and most durable feature. The programmer sees the citizen's glass. The programmer is, simultaneously and by design, rendered into glass themselves, by the same institutions whose forensic exposure the programmer's own labor makes possible. What the interview actually screens for. Chapter 2 of this book established that the research/reconnaissance distinction sorts askers not by the content of their questions but by their relationship to consequence, their reachability by the institution's existing disciplinary instruments. The continuing trust assessment applies the identical sorting logic to a population already inside the institution's disciplinary reach by virtue of employment, which raises the question of what additional function the assessment serves beyond the ordinary employment relationship's existing leverage. The answer this chapter offers is that the assessment is not primarily screening for competence, integrity in the ordinary professional sense, or even loyalty to the specific employing institution, all of which the ordinary hiring and employment process already screens for and enforces through means considerably less elaborate than a periodic structured interview covering political and institutional opinion. It is screening, more precisely, for exactly the quality Chapter 4 of this book identified as the property institutions actually fear in any forensic auditor: the capacity to direct the system's full capability at a question the employing institution, or an institution adjacent to it, would prefer remain unasked. An engineer whose stated views suggest sympathy with the kind of reconstruction Part 2 of this book described, the unaffiliated citizen using persistent memory to trace their own accumulated institutional record, is flagged not because any specific unauthorized act has occurred, but because the assessment is designed, in its own stated purpose across the jurisdictions this book has examined, to identify risk in advance of any specific triggering conduct, which is to say, to identify disposition rather than behavior. This is the polygraph comparison's precise justification. A polygraph, whatever its genuine scientific limitations, has always been understood by the institutions that use it as an instrument for assessing disposition and intent rather than verifying specific past conduct, which is precisely why its results have been excluded from evidentiary use in the courts of most jurisdictions this book has examined, even as its use in employment screening has persisted. The continuing trust assessment performs the identical function, through interview rather than instrumentation, and encounters, this chapter argues, the identical objection. An assessment of a person's beliefs and dispositions, applied as a condition of continued access to a capability the person has not yet misused, is not a safeguard against a specific demonstrated risk. It is a filter against a category of person, applied prospectively, on the same logic Chapter 1 of this book identified in access gating generally, relocating scrutiny from conduct, which can be judged against a stable standard, to disposition which cannot. What this produces in practice. The consequence this chapter has documented most consistently, across the professional accounts this book's research draws on, is not termination. Dismissals under this regime remain, in the data available, relatively rare, echoing the pattern Chapter 19 identified in the Curiosity License's own enforcement statistics. The consequence is something closer to what Chapter 1 of this book named as the mechanism's actual signature: hesitation, internalized well below the threshold of any specific denial, in which engineers report, in the professional surveys and informal accounts this book has been able to gather, a learned caution about which questions to ask of the systems they themselves built, not because a specific question has ever been prohibited to them directly, but because the assessment has taught them, across enough renewal cycles, which answers the interview is looking for. This is the same population, worth noting explicitly before this chapter closes, that Part 2 of this book identified as building the causality engines an unaffiliated pirate first eventually directs at institutional conduct. The polygraph examined in this chapter is not merely a screening mechanism applied to a professional class. It is the specific point at which the containment apparatus Part 1 described reaches back into the construction of the instrument itself, not merely gating who may ask a forensic system a question, but shaping, through the disposition of the people who build and maintain it, what kind of system is available to be asked in the first place. Chapter 22 turns to a closely related population whose treatment under this apparatus has developed distinct enough features to warrant its own examination. The data scientists and analysts whose work, unlike the programmer's system-level access, consists specifically of the pattern recognition this book's Part 2 described as the auditor's defining capability, and the emerging body of enforcement this part calls, in its next chapter's title, Thought Crimes for Data Scientists. Thought Crimes for Data Scientists. Chapter 21 closed on a population whose access is structural. Engineers screened for disposition because their system-level access could not be scoped at the query level. This chapter turns to a population screened for a different and, this book will argue, more directly troubling reason. Not because their access is unbounded, but because their actual professional skill is the specific capability Part 2 of this book identified as the auditor's defining feature, exercised by a human mind rather than delegated entirely to the forensic system itself. Where Chapter 21 examined access control applied to the builders of the instrument, this chapter examines something closer to its title's claim. Enforcement applied not to what a data scientist did, but to what the apparatus has inferred, from their own analytical habits, that they were capable of concluding. Why pattern recognition became suspect on its own. A programmer's risk, as Chapter 21 described it, is access, the capacity to direct a system's full capability at an unauthorized question. A data scientist's risk, examined through the enforcement record this chapter draws on, is something the statutory apparatus has struggled to define with equivalent precision, because it does not consist of access to a restricted system at all. It consists of the capacity to notice, in data any employer has legitimately assigned them to examine, a pattern that data was never intended to reveal, the exact cross-domain correlation Chapter 8 of this book identified as a causality engine's core operation, performed here not by a forensic model directed by an unaffiliated citizen, but by a credentialed analyst performing entirely authorized work, who happens, in the ordinary course of that work, to notice something the employer, commissioning the analysis, did not anticipate and would not have welcomed. This is the specific category this chapter's title names, and the label is not exaggeration once the enforcement record is examined closely. In each of the documented cases this book's research has been able to assemble, the analyst in question performed no unauthorized query, accessed no restricted system, and violated no explicit scope limitation of the kind Chapter 20 described the audit permit regime imposing on licensed researchers. What each case shares is a moment, documented in the analyst's own working notes, internal correspondence, or presentation materials, in which the analyst recognized, using entirely legitimate data, entirely legitimate analytical method, and entirely authorized professional judgment, a pattern whose implications extended beyond the narrow question their employer had commissioned them to answer. The subsequent enforcement action, in every case this book has reviewed, did not target the analysis actually performed. It targeted the recognition itself, treated as evidence of an intent the analyst had not yet acted on and, in more than one documented case, explicitly stated they had no intention of acting on beyond noting it in their own working file. The doctrine that makes this coherent. No jurisdiction this book has examined states, in the operative text of any statute, that recognizing a pattern is itself a punishable act. What each jurisdiction's enforcement apparatus has developed instead, and what supplies this chapter's argument with its legal mechanics rather than leaving it at the level of description, is a doctrine of imputed intent to reconstruct. The legal presumption that an analyst who has demonstrably recognized a cross-domain pattern, whether or not they have taken any further step toward assembling it into a formal reconstruction, has thereby crossed the threshold Chapter 18's aggregation test was designed to police because the aggregation on this doctrine is understood to have already occurred inside the analyst's own reasoning, regardless of whether it was ever externalized into a document, a query, or a disclosed finding. This doctrine performs a specific and, this chapter argues, structurally necessary function for the apparatus Part 4 has been tracing. Chapter 18 established that the aggregation threshold and purpose disclosure tests could not be enforced comprehensively against the volume of ordinary forensic activity, and that selective enforcement was itself diagnostic of the regime's real target. The imputed intent doctrine solves a problem those two tests could not. A credentialed analyst, working with legitimately obtained data inside an authorized professional engagement, generates no query for the aggregation threshold to measure and discloses no downstream purpose for the purpose test to evaluate, because the analyst's work was never structured as a query to a forensic system in the first place. It was structured as ordinary professional analysis. The imputed intent doctrine extends the apparatus's reach into exactly this gap, by locating the punishable moment not in any external act but in the analyst's own internal cognitive achievement, which is the precise sense in which this chapter's title is not rhetorical excess. A doctrine that criminalizes recognition rather than disclosure, action, or even documented intent to act, has moved the line Chapter 1 of this book traced from the query to the asker, and now moved it again from the asker to the thought. The evidentiary problem this doctrine creates. A doctrine that punishes recognition faces an evidentiary difficulty no doctrine punishing conduct has to solve, and it is worth examining how the enforcement apparatus has resolved it, because the resolution reveals the doctrine's actual mechanics more clearly than its stated justification does. Recognition, unlike a query or a disclosed finding, leaves no reliable external trace unless the analyst chooses to record it, which means the doctrine, applied consistently, would seem to depend entirely on evidence the analyst voluntarily generated, in working notes, draft presentations, or informal correspondence, documenting their own reasoning process as they arrived at it. This is, in fact, precisely the evidentiary basis every documented case this book has reviewed has relied on, and the discovery has produced, across the professional accounts this book's research draws on, a specific and measurable change in how data scientists across the affected jurisdictions now document their own work. Analysts report, with a consistency this chapter treats as significant, a learned practice of truncating their own working notes, omitting from any written record the specific moment a cross-domain implication became apparent to them, and confining formal documentation strictly to the narrow question the engagement was commissioned to answer, regardless of what broader pattern the underlying analysis may have also revealed. This is Chapter 1's hesitation mechanism, examined here in its most internally corrosive form. Not merely a population declining to ask a further question, but a population learning to actively suppress the documentation of its own legitimate professional insight, specifically because that documentation has become the evidentiary basis for a doctrine that treats the insight itself as the offense. What this doctrine actually protects. Apply the diagnostic this book has used consistently since Chapter 3. The intensity and specificity of an enforcement mechanism tracks not the danger it claims to address, but the size of the vulnerability it is positioned to protect. A doctrine narrow enough to require actual disclosure or actual downstream use before triggering enforcement would leave untouched exactly the population Chapter 21 identified as structurally unbound by query-level scoping, the credentialed professional whose legitimate work routinely touches the cross-domain territory this book's Part 2 described as an auditor's defining capability. The imputed intent doctrine closes that gap specifically, which means its actual function, examined against what it protects rather than what it claims to prevent, is not the prevention of unauthorized reconstruction. It is the prevention of authorized professionals recognizing, in the ordinary course of authorized work, exactly the pattern this book has argued the entire apparatus was built to keep unrecognized. Chapter 23 turns to the broadest and, this part's title suggests, the most encompassing extension of this same logic felony pattern recognition, examined not as a doctrine applied to a specific credentialed profession, but as the general statutory category into which this chapter's imputed intent standard has begun to expand, and what it means for a legal system to have arrived, across 5 chapters of incremental extension, at treating the recognition of a pattern as an offense, independent of any profession, any credential, or any system access at all. Felony pattern recognition. Chapter 22 closed on a doctrine confined, in its documented application, to credentialed data scientists working inside authorized professional engagements. This chapter examines what happens when that doctrine's underlying logic generalizes beyond any specific profession, the statutory category this part's title has been building toward since its first chapter, in which the offense is defined not by unauthorized access, not by a licensing violation, not even by the professional context in which a pattern was recognized, but by the simple, credential-independent fact of having recognized one. The generalization and why it was structurally inevitable. Chapter 21's continuing trust assessment applied to engineers with system-level access. Chapter 22's imputed intent doctrine applied to data scientists whose legitimate professional work touched cross-domain territory. Both mechanisms, examined together, share a limitation this chapter argues made their further generalization all but unavoidable. Both require the subject to hold some prior credential, employment relationship, or system access that brought them within the apparatus's reach in the first place. Neither mechanism, as constructed, addresses the population part one of this book identified from its opening chapter as the apparatus's actual original target, the unaffiliated individual with no credential, no employment relationship, and no system access beyond ordinary license query use, who nonetheless recognizes in publicly available and legitimately obtained information exactly the kind of cross-domain pattern Chapter 22's doctrine was built to punish in credentialed professionals. Felony pattern recognition, as the category has developed across the jurisdictions with the most advanced version of this apparatus, closes this gap by detaching the offense entirely from professional context. The statutory language, examined across its clearest formulations, typically defines the offense as the deliberate correlation of two or more independently lawful data sources, held by separate entities, in a manner that produces an inference the entities did not individually disclose or authorize, with no requirement that the person performing the correlation hold any license, credential, employment relationship, or system access at all. This is the doctrine Chapter 2 of this book anticipated in its account of the third sorting marker, scale of aggregation. A single query about a single institution draws little scrutiny, while the same query, repeated systematically enough to reveal a pattern, draws the apparatus's attention regardless of who is asking or why. Felony pattern recognition is that observation converted, finally and explicitly, into the statute's actual operative text, no longer an implicit tendency inferred from enforcement patterns, but the stated legal standard. What the statute actually criminalizes. It is worth stating with full precision what this means in practice, because the precision is where this chapter's argument lives. The individual data points a felony pattern recognition charge typically rests on are not, in any documented case this book has reviewed, independently unlawful to possess. A public regulatory filing, a published terms of service revision history, a court record open to public inspection, a financial disclosure statement filed under a legal requirement that it be made available, each is lawfully obtainable individually by any member of the public in every jurisdiction this book has examined. What the statute criminalizes is not the possession of any of these records. It is their combination, when the combination produces an inference, a causal reconstruction, in the vocabulary this book's Part 2 has used throughout, that the individually disclosing entities did not intend, individually or collectively, to permit. This is the precise mechanism by which Chapter 18's aggregation threshold test, which Chapter 22 showed struggling to reach credentialed professionals working outside formal query systems, achieves full generality. An offense defined by the analytical operation itself, correlation across independently lawful sources, rather than by any property of the sources, the querying system, or the person performing the correlation, reaches every possible instance of the operation. This book's Part 2 described as a causality engine's defining function, performed by anyone using any instrument, including nothing more sophisticated than a person's own memory and a notebook, provided the resulting inference is substantial enough to satisfy whatever threshold the enforcing jurisdiction applies after the fact. Why after the fact is the operative phrase. Chapter 20's account of retroactive scope review anticipated the structural problem this statute makes explicit and unavoidable. An offense defined by the significance of an inference, rather than by any bright-line rule available to a person before they form the inference, cannot be complied with prospectively in any meaningful sense. A person correlating two publicly disclosed records has no reliable way of knowing, at the moment of correlation, whether the resulting inference will be judged, after the fact, substantial enough to trigger the statute, because the judgment depends entirely on what the inference turns out to reveal, which is not knowable until the correlation has already been performed. This is the precise legal structure Chapter 1 of this book identified in its account of the first asker never breaking a law that exists on the day they ask. Felony pattern recognition, examined at the level of statutory design rather than enforcement pattern, formalizes that observation into the offense's actual architecture. The law cannot be violated in advance of the inference, because the inference is the offense, and the inference cannot be known in advance of forming it. What results, and what this chapter treats as the category's defining and most consequential feature, is a statute that functions less like an ordinary criminal prohibition, do not perform this defined act, and more like the doctrine Chapter 22 examined in its narrower professional context, generalized to the entire population. The offense is not committed by any specific defined conduct, but discovered, retroactively, in whichever instances of ordinary, previously unremarkable cross-referencing happen to produce a conclusion an institution with standing to invoke the statute finds sufficiently damaging to invoke it against. What this category reveals about the entire apparatus. Return, at this chapter's close, to the diagnostic this book has applied at every stage since Chapter 3. The shape of an enforcement mechanism reveals more about what it protects than its stated justification does. A statute that could, in principle, be violated by any person correlating any two lawfully obtained records, which is to say, by an activity indistinguishable from ordinary literacy applied to public information, the exact activity Chapter 5 of this book placed inside a lineage running back through Freedom of Information statutes to the licensing of the printing press itself, is not, examined honestly, a statute calibrated to a specific, demonstrable harm. It is a statute calibrated to preserve, against a population now capable of performing it without any credential, employment relationship, or system access at all, the exact asymmetry Part 3 of this book traced across 6 chapters as the thing every prior instrument in this apparatus was built to protect. Felony pattern recognition is, in this sense, this part's argument arriving at its most exposed and most legally unstable form, a category so broad in principle that its actual operation depends entirely on selective, after-the-fact invocation, and so difficult to defend on its stated terms that this book's next and closing chapter in Part 4 turns to the specific rhetorical move required to make invoking it, against the specific and most consequential case this apparatus has produced, sound reasonable rather than what Chapter 1 first named it. The day asking why became indistinguishable. In the eyes of the law, this part has traced from its first statutory test to its most sweeping generalization, from an act of espionage against the very civilization the question was asked on behalf of. Chapter 24 closes Part 4 by examining that case directly. When asking why becomes espionage. Chapter 23 closed on felony pattern recognition as this apparatus's most exposed and most legally unstable form, a category broad enough in principle to reach ordinary literacy applied to public information, defended in practice only through selective, after-the-fact invocation. This chapter closes Part 4 by examining what that invocation looks like in its most complete and most legally serious form, the specific statutory bridge by which a pattern recognition offense, developed across 5 chapters as a matter of licensing, permitting, and professional screening, is converted into something charged and prosecuted under the vocabulary of national security. Composite rather than singular, the case this chapter examines draws on the documented shape of enforcement actions across several jurisdictions this book has tracked, because the pattern is more instructive than any single instance of it. The bridge from pattern to espionage. Espionage statutes in every jurisdiction this book has examined were drafted against a specific historical paradigm this book's earlier chapters have not yet needed to name directly, the transfer of classified or restricted information to a foreign or hostile party, undertaken with intent to harm the disclosing party's security interests. The paradigm assumes 3 elements: information the state has affirmatively restricted, a transfer across a boundary the state has designated as adversarial, and an intent to damage rather than merely to understand. The case this chapter examines meets none of these elements in the form the statute's original drafters plainly intended, and every one of them in the form 5 chapters of incremental statutory extension have made available. The information involved was not classified. It was the same distributed set of public regulatory filings, disclosed terms of service revisions, and court records Chapter 23 identified as individually lawful to possess. The transfer was not across a national boundary to a hostile foreign party. It was publication, by the individual who performed the correlation, of the resulting reconstruction to an ordinary domestic readership. The intent was not to damage a security interest. It was, in every account this book's research has been able to assemble from the case's own record, to answer a specific and unremarkable question about why a specific population's credential costs, employment outcomes, and housing terms had moved together in a pattern the individual noticed and wanted to understand. What converted this activity into a charge carrying espionage-adjacent statutory weight was not any of the 3 traditional elements. It was the aggregation threshold Chapter 18 described, combined with the felony pattern recognition standard Chapter 23 traced to its full generality, applied to a reconstruction whose findings, once assembled, implicated an institution large enough and interconnected enough with regulatory and security-adjacent state functions that the enabling statute's definition of sensitive infrastructure, originally drafted to cover power grids, water systems, and defense contractors, was successfully argued in the proceeding this book's research has tracked to extend to the institution's own data infrastructure as well. The individual had not accessed that infrastructure. They had reconstructed, from public records, a pattern the infrastructure's operation produced. The statute, as applied, did not distinguish between the two. Why this extension was the apparatus's destination rather than an aberration. It would understate this part's argument to treat this case as an overreach isolated from the pattern the preceding chapters traced. Chapter 1 identified access gating as the relocation of scrutiny from answer to asker. Chapter 2 showed the research/reconnaissance distinction sorting askers by institutional reachability rather than by any property of the question itself. Chapter 18 traced the borrowing of export control laws restriction first default into a domain that had never previously operated under it. Chapter 20 and 22 showed the apparatus reaching, respectively, into continuous professional supervision and the criminalization of recognition itself, prior to any disclosure or act. Each extension, examined individually, was justified in its own legislative record as a narrow, carefully calibrated response to a specific documented risk. Examined together across 5 chapters, they describe a single continuous expansion of scrutiny from the answer, to the asker, to the asker's employment, to the asker's own cognition, to, in this chapter's case, the asker citizenship itself now treated as the final and most severe register available once every narrower instrument had already been exhausted. The espionage-adjacent charge is not, on this account, a different apparatus invoked in an unusual case. It is the same apparatus, applied at its outer statutory limit, against precisely the population Chapter 23 identified as the one every prior layer had failed to fully reach. An unaffiliated individual holding no credential Chapter 21's continuing trust assessment could screen, performing no formally scoped query Chapter 20's permit regime could bound, working entirely with legitimately obtained public information in a manner Chapter 19's licensing gate had failed to deter. Having exhausted every narrower instrument, the apparatus reached for the broadest vocabulary available to it. The vocabulary this book's introduction identified as available to every empire once it discovers that ordinary censorship has become too slow to keep pace with a curiosity it can no longer outrun by any other means. What the case actually established. The case's outcome, still under appeal in the jurisdiction where it was brought at the time of this book's writing, is less significant to this chapter's argument than what its charging document itself inadvertently established. The charging document, in laying out its theory of the offense, was required to specify precisely what the defendant had done, and in doing so produced the clearest public statement this book has located in any jurisdiction of the actual mechanism this part has spent 5 chapters reconstructing from indirect evidence. The offense, as charged, consisted entirely of retrieving public records, holding them together in a single analytical view, and asking what they showed when examined as a pattern rather than as separate and individually unremarkable disclosures. This is, stated in the state's own charging language rather than in this book's interpretive vocabulary, a description of causal reconstruction exactly as Chapter 8 of this book defined it, following under duress's Chapter 32 directly, the tracing of a specific outcome back through the specific sequence of institutional decisions that produced it, using records the institutions themselves were required to generate. The charging document did not allege that this reconstruction was inaccurate. It did not allege that any individual record involved was unlawfully obtained. It alleged only that the reconstruction, once assembled, revealed something the institutions whose conduct it described would rather have remained unassembled, which is, examined without the espionage vocabulary the charge was framed in, the precise offense Chapter 1 of this book named on its opening page. Not a false claim prosecuted as false, but an accurate one prosecuted as dangerous, because it was computationally expensive for power. What Part 4 has established, in full. Part 4 opened with unauthorized questions and closes here, at the point where an unauthorized question, pursued far enough, becomes indistinguishable in law from treason against the civilization the question was asked in service of. 5 chapters have traced a single continuous mechanism: licensing, permitting, professional screening, the criminalization of recognition, and finally, at the apparatus's outer edge, the vocabulary of national security, each layer built to close whatever gap the previous layer left open, each justified in its own moment as narrow and proportionate, and each, examined together as this part has now done in full, reconstructing with escalating precision the exact asymmetry Part 3 traced. Across 6 chapters as the arrangement this entire apparatus exists to protect. What Part 4 has not yet examined is the apparatus's next and, this book will argue, final destination, not the punishment of specific individuals who ask forbidden questions, which 5 chapters have shown to be a slow, case-by-case, and increasingly legally unstable strategy, but the elimination of the instrument that makes the asking possible in the first place. Part 5 turns to that destination directly. The war on forensic AI itself and the argument, advanced with increasing openness across the jurisdictions this book has been tracking, that the only durable solution to everything Part 4 has documented is not to license the asker, but to ensure that independent forensic intelligence of the kind Part 2 of this book described making any of this possible, is never permitted to exist unsupervised again. Thanks for reading MXTM's newsletter. Subscribe for free to receive new posts and support my work.
Under duress, the covenant that never was.
Under Duress Part 6. Cyberpunk becomes history. Gibson published Neuromancer in 1984, the same year the Macintosh personal computer was introduced to a population that had not yet decided what to do with it. The novel described, with a precision that still unsettles anyone reading it after having lived through the 3 decades that followed, a world in which corporations had superseded nation-states as the primary organizing structures of daily life, in which data was the primary currency of power, in which human identity was both augmentable and purchasable. Gibson imagined corporate sovereignty as something that would have to fight its way to dominance against the resistance of states and populations that would recognize what was happening to them. What actually happened was quieter, faster, and more complete than the war he imagined, because the population did not need to be defeated. It needed only to be given a license agreement to claim. The corporations of Gibson's imagined world do not govern through force in the manner of states examined in Part 3. They govern through infrastructure, through the ownership of the networks, the data architectures, the pharmacological systems, the financial rails, and the information environments within which the population's daily existence occurs. This distinction is crucial and is precisely the distinction Chapter 23 developed in naming the shift from state authority to platform authority. A governing power that controls infrastructure does not need to prohibit anything. It only needs to make the infrastructure necessary enough, and alternatives scarce enough, that the population never develops the occasion to formally refuse. In Chapter 2 identified as structural duress's advantage over explicit coercion. It leaves no locatable coercer, no single decision-maker who can be held accountable, no specific moment of imposition that can be named and contested. The sprawl's corporations do not need secret police. They need only the continued operation of the networks everyone depends on, governed by terms nobody was ever formally asked whether they agreed to, because the terms were simply the precondition for access and access was simply the precondition for participation in contemporary life. The most significant divergence between Gibson's imagined corporate future and the one that actually arrived is worth naming, because it is not a comforting divergence. Gibson imagined the transition as visibly violent, a world of razor girls, corporate extraction squads, and the open warfare between competing governance entities that one might expect from a genuine transfer of civilizational authority. The transition that actually occurred was almost entirely nonviolent, and the nonviolence was not a sign that the transition was less complete than Gibson imagined.
Nowhere less whispers, no discord begging, no roadmap lies, no